Settle in. Let your eyes grow heavy and your mind drift gently back in time. Imagine the soft flicker of candlelight casting long shadows on stone walls, the scent of beeswax mingling with the cool, damp air of an early European dawn. Outside, the world is quietly the faint creaking of wooden carts, or the muffled footsteps of peasants disturbing the hush. You are about to step into a world both familiar and foreign, a world where sickness had no name, and storms were blamed on witches, a time when everyday life was guided not by science or reason, but by ritual, omen, and belief. Tonight, we travel into the curious corners of the medieval mind, a time when superstition wasn't merely background noise, it was the very lens through which reality was understood. In this slow and steady journey through the strange superstitions of the Middle Ages, you'll witness how fear and faith shape the rhythms of daily life. From whispering charms over butter churns, to nailing shoes to walls to ward off spirits, we will gently explore this tapestry of ritual and worry, of the mystical stitched into the mundane. So let your thoughts soften and your breath slow. You're safe here, in the quiet of this storytelling hour. The past awaits, with all its strange customs and curious comforts. Let us begin. Imagine yourself walking down a narrow dirt path in a small medieval village. The cottages around you are timber-framed, their wattle and daub walls streaked with the remnants of last night's rain. A low mist hangs over the thatched roofs, and the air smells of damp earth and wood smoke. It is early morning, and the village is stirring. Inside one of these cottages, a woman prepares bread for the day. Before kneading the dough, she crosses herself, not solely as a gesture of piety, but as a way to keep evil spirits from entering the loaf. If the bread failed to rise, it would not be blamed on the yeast or the flour. No, the villagers would whisper about curses or the evil eye. A suspicious glance from a neighbor the day before might now seem a plausible reason for failure. In this world, nothing was purely accidental. Every illness, every failed harvest, every stroke of bad luck was thought to have a deeper, hidden cause. Medieval people didn't separate the physical and the spiritual, as we often do today. A toothache could be the result of sin. A sick cow might mean someone had cast a spell. These beliefs wove themselves into daily routine like the fibers of flax into cloth. Superstition was not a sign of ignorance, but of caution. The unseen world was perilous, and it was best to stay on its good side. Children were protected with amulets, often made of herbs or small bones. Iron objects, particularly nails or horseshoes, were affixed to doors to repel wandering spirits. It wasn't uncommon for a mother to burn a bit of her child's hair, mixing the ashes into a poultice if she feared a curse had been placed on them. Farming, the backbone of village life, was also entangled with the supernatural. Crops were planted according to lunar phases. A rabbit seen crossing a field at dawn could be an omen to delay the ploughing. Seeds might be blessed, or even buried alongside tiny trinkets meant to feed the soil. The success or failure of a harvest affected not just bellies, but spiritual balance, and farmers rarely took chances. Inside the home, countless little rituals governed behavior. Salt was precious not only for preserving food, but because it was believed to absorb negative energy. Spilling salt could invite bad fortune unless a pinch was thrown over the left shoulder, into the face of the lurking devil. Mirrors, though rare, were treated cautiously. Breaking one could bring 7 years of misfortune, though this belief likely predates the Middle Ages and continued long afterward. And then there were the sounds, the howls of dogs in the night, the hoot of an owl near your window, the creaking of rafters in the wind. These were not ignored. Each had meaning. A dog howling could mean death approached. An owl's cry might signal a nearby witch or a restless soul. People learned to read the world like a code, always scanning for signs, interpreting nature not with logic, but with law. In this way, daily life was a balancing act between the known and the unknown, the visible and the invisible. Superstition became a kind of second language, unspoken, yet understood by all. It gave order to chaos and comfort to fear. And while it may seem strange to us now, for many medieval people, it was the thread that held life together. As we step further into this world, let us now explore the people who shaped it, not just the peasants and farmers, but those whose lives were defined by fear, faith, and strange beliefs. Our next journey takes us into the lives of the wandering healers, the cunning folk, and the accused. As you drift deeper into the medieval world, imagine now a solitary figure at the edge of the village. Her home is not in the square near the church or the baker's stall, but nestled just beyond the hedgerows, where the trees grow thicker and the soil stays damp even in summer. She is known as a wise woman, though the term varies from region to region. Others might call her a cunning woman, a herb wife, or in darker whispers, a witch. But she is no villain in her time. In truth, she is someone the villagers visit in quiet desperation. When the priest cannot cure a fever, when a child cries endlessly without cause, when a cow gives bloody milk, people find their way to her door. Her remedies are drawn from the natural world: dried lavender to calm the restless, feverfew for headaches, nettles to cleanse the blood. She speaks in hushed tones, offering bundles of herbs tied with coloured thread, murmuring charms that are half prayer, half poetry. And though she is feared by some, she is respected by many more. The line between healer and heretic, however, is a narrow one. Her knowledge, passed through generations by word of mouth, exists outside the bounds of the church. This makes her powerful but dangerously so. The church does not take kindly to those who operate in the margins, especially those who claim to affect the unseen forces that cause misfortune. Not all cunning folk were women, of course. Men too worked as healers and charmers, often calling themselves pellers or conjurers. Some offered protective spells for travellers or read omens in animal entrails. Others inscribed protective symbols on bits of parchment to be sewn into garments. These men and women existed in a strange twilight, sometimes revered, sometimes reviled. Accusation, in this world, was a fearful thing. If a person fell ill after a quarrel, or if misfortune followed a poorly exchanged word, suspicion might fall on a cunning neighbour. Their knowledge, once sought after, could be turned against them in an instant. To be accused of witchcraft was not merely to be feared, it was to be isolated, cast out, and often punished. Yet the idea of the witch in the medieval period was different than the image that would later emerge in the witch trials of the early modern era. In the earlier Middle Ages, accusations were rare, and belief in magical women was interwoven with a broader acceptance of folk practices. But as church authority grew stronger, and as doctrine hardened, space for these folk practitioners shrank. What was once considered helpful, like a charm to ease childbirth, could be reinterpreted as diabolical. Many of these accusations were rooted in fear of the unknown, of illness, of mortality. In the absence of scientific explanations, people sought order in a world that often felt cruel and unpredictable. Superstition became a tool to make sense of suffering, and unfortunately, that search for sense sometimes led to scapegoating. Still, among the rural and the poor, belief in the cunning folk persisted. They were seen as part of the natural order and extension of the land itself. If the priests held sway over the soul, the wise women and men held sway over the body and the fortune of the household. Their legacy is scattered now, like dried herbs on the wind, but you can still find echoes in old folk remedies, in stories passed down by grandmothers, in whispered prayers said more from habit than belief. The memory of these healers lingers, like a footprint in soft mud at the edge of the forest. Now, with their world in mind, let us continue onward, not into the dark woods, but into the curious chambers of medieval medicine, where superstition often sat beside surgery, and where healing could be as strange as the ailment itself. Imagine now the narrow corridors of a medieval infirmary. The air inside is dense, thick with the mingled scent of rosemary, vinegar, and damp linen. Light filters through high, narrow windows, catching dust motes that drift slowly in the stillness. In the center of the room, a man lies feverish on a straw-stuffed mattress, and nearby, a physician examines him not with a thermometer or stethoscope, but with a chart of the stars and a vial of the man's urine held up to the light. Medicine in the Middle Ages was as much an art of symbols as of substances. It drew not only from Greek and Roman texts, but from celestial alignments, religious doctrine, and deeply rooted superstitions. Physicians were often university trained, but their tools included horoscopes and herbal tinctures, prayers and purging. Disease was not merely physicalit, was a spiritual imbalance, a moral flaw, or a punishment from God. One of the most persistent concepts was the theory of humours. It taught that the human body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was thought to arise from their balance. Illness came when one dominated. Too much black bile, for example, might cause melancholy. Too much phlegm might make a person sluggish and pale. Treatment, therefore, focused on restoring balance, often through bleeding, induced vomiting, or enemas. But beneath these academic frameworks lay a bedrock of superstition. Physicians consulted the zodiac before diagnosing or treating. Certain days were deemed unlucky for surgeries, others ideal for bloodletting. A cut made during the waning moon was thought to heal poorly. Stars, it was believed, influenced not just crops, but veins, organs, and emotions. Amulets were worn to ward off illness. Some contained written prayers, others bits of coral, amber, or dried toads wrapped in cloth. These were not mere tokens, they were believed to protect the wearer from bad air or malevolent forces, both of which were thought to cause disease. The infamous plague doctor, with his beaked mask, carried strong-smelling herbs not only to combat stench, but to ward off evil vapours believed to carry sickness. Charms and rituals often accompanied treatments. A sore throat might be treated by wrapping a strip of bacon around the neck, left overnight while a prayer was whispered. Boils could be transferred to a tree by rubbing the swelling against bark while reciting an incantation. Some practitioners advised tying a frog to the neck to draw out illness, or placing slices of onion on the soles of the feet to extract fevers. Even hospitals were infused with spiritual symbolism. Monastic infirmaries placed patients facing east, toward Jerusalem. Healing was as much about faith as it was about flesh. A pilgrimage might be prescribed alongside a potion. The shrine of a saint could offer hope, where no remedy sufficed. And of course, when no healing came, blame often followed. It might fall upon witches, Jews, or lepers, those seen as outside the protective fold of Christendom. Scapegoating offered a kind of emotional medicine for communities gripped by fear. It allowed suffering to make sense, even if falsely. Yet within these strange beliefs was an earnest desire to understand the human body and its afflictions. People wanted relief, just as we do. They trusted in what they had: scripture, stars, and old wives' tales. And through them, they tried to bind the chaotic world into something they could grasp, something they could soothe. As we leave the dim infirmaries behind, our path now takes us into the realm of death and burial, where superstition guided the journey beyond the veil. For in the Middle Ages, dying well was as important as living well, and both required navigating a host of unseen forces. Now, picture a quiet churchyard at the edge of a medieval village. The earth is uneven, interrupted by lichen-covered stones and wooden markers that lean with age. Beneath these plots lie the generations of the village farmers, mothers, children buried according to rites that blended religious tradition with ancient, lingering superstition. To die in the Middle Ages was not simply to cease living, it was to embark upon a perilous journey of the soul. People feared not just death itself, but what might come after. Superstition coloured every part of the process, from the dying breath to the days that followed burial. It was believed that spirits could linger, especially if a person died unconfessed, unbaptized, or violently. The good death, as it was known, required spiritual preparation, the presence of clergy, and specific prayers. Without these, the soul might wander, trapped between realms. The moment of death was often marked with ritual. Candles were lit to guide the soul. Bells were rung to announce the passing not just to the living, but to ward off demons who might try to seize the spirit. A bowl of holy water might be placed by the bed. Mirrors, if any existed in the home, were covered to prevent the soul from seeing its reflection and becoming trapped. Once the body was prepared, it would be washed, dressed, and watched over often by family or members of a local guild. This vigil, known as a wake, was not simply an act of mourning. It was also a protective ritual. Stories abounded of corpses rising, particularly those of the unrepentant or wrongdoers. To guard against this, some families placed small stones or even coins under the tongue of the deceased, or tied the jaw shut with cloth to keep the mouth closed. It was said that a corpse with an open mouth might draw breath and return. Graves themselves were carefully oriented. Most were dug east to west, the head placed to the west, so that on the day of judgment, the dead might rise facing the new dawn. In some regions, iron nails or thorns were placed in the coffin to deter evil spirits. Occasionally, bodies were buried with salt or holy objects tucked into the folds of their shrouds. These small gestures were meant to protect not only the soul of the departed, but also the living, who feared the return of the restless dead. A particularly chilling superstition was that of the revenant, a being who returned from the grave to haunt the living. Revenants were blamed for plagues, crop failures, and sudden deaths. These were not yet the romantic vampires of later legend, but troubling echoes of people who, for one reason or another, had not found peace. Medieval texts recount strange rituals for dealing with such beings, sexhuming and reburying the body, decapitating it, or placing heavy stones on the chest or limbs to pin it down. More benign were beliefs about spirits who lingered out of love or obligation. A mother might return to rock a child's cradle, or a deceased husband to protect his widow. These stories offered comfort, but they also reinforced the idea that death was not a clean break, but a transformation. The boundary between life and afterlife was thin, porous, and easily crossed. Superstition extended even to grave goods and cemetery placement. It was considered bad luck to disturb a grave, and those who did knowingly or not were often blamed for any misfortunes that followed. This led to the development of rituals for appeasing the dead, including offerings of bread, coins, or prayers at anniversaries. Some tombs were even designed with soul holes, small openings to allow the spirit to exit peacefully. These practices, while foreign to modern sensibilities, served a vital purpose. They offered structure and meaning to death, a deeply feared and mysterious process. They gave the living ways to honor, protect, and understand what had happened, even when grief clouded clarity. As we leave the cemetery, and its quiet watchfulness behind, our journey continues into the realm of animals and omens where even a cat's yawn or a bird's shadow could change the course of a day. In medieval thought, nature itself was never silent, but always speaking. Let your thoughts now drift into the countryside, where the boundaries between human life and nature were soft and constantly shifting. In the medieval world, animals were not just beasts of burden or sources of food. They were watchers, messengers, sometimes even warnings. The flap of a bird's wing, the cry of a fox at dusk, the sudden silence of a ponditch held meaning. Superstition painted the natural world with layers of coded language, and to live wisely was to observe it closely. Imagine you are standing near a market square. The sun has barely risen, and a crow circles overhead. For many in this village, that simple sight might spark unease. Crows and ravens were linked to death, not just because of their black feathers and carrion diet, but because they were thought to ferry souls or signal impending loss. If one landed on the roof of a house, some believed a death would follow. To counter the omen, villagers might spit 3 times, make the sign of the cross, or recite a charm passed down through generations. Cats, too, carried deep symbolic weight. A black cat crossing your path might be seen as a sign of bad luck, especially if it moved from left to right. But curiously, cats were also respected for their ability to ward off evil spirits. They were often kept in monasteries and homes for their practical value-killing mice, but also for their perceived spiritual neutrality. Their silent presence and watchful eyes gave them a mysterious aura. Some believed they could see things humans could not. Dogs, especially those howling in the night, were thought to sense the dead or the devil himself. A dog howling outside a house where someone lay ill could spark deep fear. People might offer a whispered prayer or hang a piece of bread over the doorway to appease whatever force the dog had sensed. And then there were birds. Not just crows and ravens, but owls, magpies, and even sparrows could carry messages from the unseen world. An owl hooting 3 times in quick succession near a window could signify death or misfortune. Magpies were watched closely. 1 alone was sorrow, 2 were joy, 3 were a funeral. People would recite rhymes under their breath to counter what they saw. If a bird flew into a house, it was taken seriously, sometimes interpreted as a soul entering, other times as a warning. Beyond animals, the very weather could speak. A thunderstorm in winter might be taken as a divine reprimand. Sudden, violent winds were not just meteorological events. They were signs of unrest in the heavens, or the presence of angry spirits. Shooting stars, eclipses, and comets, these were not astronomical curiosities but serious portents. Whole communities would gather in churches to pray during eclipses, believing that such an event might herald plague, war, or judgment. Superstition also touched domestic animals. A cow that refused to give milk might be thought bewitched. Farmers sometimes passed burning herbs beneath the animal's belly, or scraped a bit of iron along its side, while chanting to break the imagined spell. Horses that startled without cause might be seen as having glimpsed something unnatural, a spirit, a cursed object, or a witch in disguise. Even insects were not immune to symbolism. Bees, for instance, were considered especially spiritual creatures. There was a widespread belief that you must tell the bees when someone died, lest they fly away or stop producing honey. Hives were often draped in black cloths during mourning. In return, it was believed the bees might carry the soul of the departed gently into the next world. The medieval mind viewed nature not as separate from the divine, but as a living manuscript written by unseen hands. Every movement, every cry, every shadow had meaning, if one only knew how to interpret it. In a world where formal knowledge was rare and science still young, these interpretations gave people a framework for understanding the mysteries that surrounded them. And so, with a quiet nod to the animals who once served as guardians and harbingers, we now step into the sacred sphere of the church and its rituals, where the holy and the superstitious often intertwined in complex and curious ways. Now, imagine the heavy stillness of a stone cathedral at dawn. Candles flicker beside carved saints, their wax dripping slowly onto cold flagstones. Incense curls into the vaulted ceiling, mixing with the early light filtering through stained glass. It is peaceful, solemn, and yet even here, within the most sacred walls, superstition lingers like smoke in the rafters. The medieval church was the spiritual axis of daily life, guiding not just belief but behavior, festivals, law, and learning. But despite its authority, the church was not immune to superstition. Indeed, in many ways, it helped shape and reinforce it. For the common person, Christianity blended seamlessly with older folk beliefs, creating a rich tapestry of rituals, symbols, and fears. Holy water was one such blending of the sacred and the superstitious. It was believed to protect homes from illness, demons, and even lightning. Villagers might sprinkle it on their doorways or livestock, or keep a vial of it near the hearth. In times of plague or drought, entire processions would formed by clergy carrying relics, sprinkling fields, roads, and town squares with holy water to drive away unseen forces. Relics themselves were surrounded by both reverence and folklore. A finger bone of a saint, a vial of martyr's blood, or a splinter of the true cross might be encased in gold and paraded through streets. These objects were said to perform miracles, curing blindness, stopping storms, even reviving the dying. Pilgrims traveled great distances to touch or glimpse them, often carrying back tokens blessed by proximity. Yet, over time, some relics developed reputations said to bring misfortune if stolen, or to cry blood as an omen. Prayers were powerful tools, but they were often paired with actions. For example, the ringing of bells wasn't just a call to service, it was also believed to chase away devils and storm clouds. The larger the bell, the greater its power. Some communities even baptized their bells, giving them names and treating them almost like spiritual guardians. Feast days and fasts were another sphere where superstition entered sacred space. Certain days were considered thin days, when the veil between the earthly and the divine was more easily crossed. On All Hallows' Eve, or the night before All Saints' Day, people lit lanterns or carved faces into turnips to ward off wandering souls. On the feast of St. Mark, it was believed that if you sat in a church from midnight to dawn, you would see ghostly processions of those destined to die that year. The Mass itself held layers of mystical significance. The moment the host was raised, the consecrated bread believed to become the body of Christ was often accompanied by whispered wishes or private prayers. It was thought that what one wished for at that precise instant might come true, especially if one's heart was clean and intent pure. Others believed that merely witnessing the elevation of the host could shield them from misfortune for days. Exorcisms were performed with equal parts ritual and folklore. A priest might use Latin prayers, but also herbs, blessed salt, or iron objects. Some even included instructions for binding spirits using specific knots or symbols drawn in chalk. The line between official doctrine and folk practice blurred, especially in rural parishes where clergy might themselves hold superstitious beliefs inherited from their communities. The church walked a delicate line, officially condemning magic and superstition, yet often incorporating its forms to maintain influence. Popular piety rosary beads, pilgrimage badges, votive candles acted as both expressions of faith and protective charms. To many, lighting a candle before an image of the Virgin wasn't just prayerful, it was a way to ask for safety in childbirth, luck in travel, or protection from storms. Even the architecture of sacred spaces reflected these dual beliefs. Gargoyles, for instance, weren't just decorative water spouts, they were guardians, meant to frighten away evil spirits. Church doors sometimes bore carved symbols or worn iron to ward off witches. The labyrinthine layouts of some cathedrals echoed older pagan traditions of mazes and sacred pathways. Thus, in the hush of the cathedral, superstition was not the enemy of faith, it was its companion. For people navigating a world of hardship, death, and mystery, both church and charm offered meaning, comfort, and hope. Together, they wove a world where the divine touched the everyday, and even the holiest rituals carried a whisper of the old, the unseen, and the unknown. As we step quietly from the sacred to the social, we now enter the world of the elite where knights, nobles, and royalty followed superstitions as elaborate as their gowns and banners, and where power was never free from fear. Now imagine the hush of a great stone hall, banners swaying gently in a breeze that slips through high arched windows. Torches flicker along the walls, casting amber light across polished armor and embroidered silks. In this space of power and privilege among kings, queens, and courtiers, superstition was not left behind. Instead, it wore a different face, draped in velvet, spoken in Latin, and often cloaked in the language of omens and fate. Nobles in the medieval world lived with constant uncertainty. War, assassination, famine, and political betrayal were persistent threats. And so, the elite sought control through rituals, astrology, relics, and the council of mystics. Kings might rule by divine right, but they often turned to the stars to time their battles, to determine the fates of their heirs, or to interpret the outcome of dreams. Astrologers held a surprising amount of influence in royal courts. A monarch might delay a coronation or wedding because the stars were not aligned favorably. Entire treaties were negotiated with celestial charts in hand. When a royal child was born, astrologers were summoned not only to draw a natal chart, but to divine character, strengths, and future dangers. A comet seen in the night sky could send an entire court into prayer, fearing it foretold disaster or death. Dreams, too, were taken seriously. A king dreaming of a broken sword or a falling tower might fast for days, or offer gifts to monasteries in hopes of averting the omen's fulfillment. Books interpreting dreams, often drawing from classical sources and folk beliefs circulated among the educated, treated almost like manuals for reading fate. Even royal clothing was not chosen solely for fashion. Certain colours were believed to attract fortune or repel harm. Blue, associated with the Virgin Mary, was thought to protect purity and favour. Red, though powerful, was often worn in moderation. Its association with blood and conflict made it a risky choice in some superstitious circles. Some nobles stitched protective symbols into their undergarments, or wore rings engraved with Latin prayers or Hebrew letters for luck. Sword-blessing rituals before battle were not purely military. They were also deeply superstitious. A blade might be dipped in holy water, or touched to a relic before a fight. Some knights believed that engraving a cross or a certain rune on their weapon would cause it to never miss its marker, protect them from fatal blows. Horses, too, were not exempt. Amulets were tied into their manes, and a knight's charger might be given consecrated oats before a tournament or campaign. Royal women often engaged in more private rituals. Fertility was a particular concern, and charms, blessed girdles, or relics of childbearing saints were commonly worn during pregnancy. During labour, sacred texts might be placed beneath pillows, and servants might recite protective prayers over the threshold to keep evil from entering the room. If a queen or noblewoman lost several children, whispers might circulate about a curse spoken or unspoken prompting clergy, and midwives alike to employ rituals of cleansing or exorcism. The politics of the royal court also turned to superstition. Spells for favour, potions to incite love, and charms to gain influence circulated in secret. Accusations of sorcery were not limited to peasant women. Queens, concubines, and court advisors might be suspected of employing dark arts to rise in rank or manipulate rulers. The fear of poisoning led some monarchs to travel with their own tasters, or to drink only from specially prepared goblets said to detect venom. In darker moments, some rulers took preemptive steps against what they feared. Stories survive of monarchs who ordered the execution or imprisonment of soothsayers, whose predictions were too grimmer, too accurate. The weight of power made superstition not just a comfort, but a tool. It was used to justify actions, to select alliances, and to defend against the unseen hand of fate. And yet, even amidst grandeur and gold, the same fears haunted the nobility as they did the peasant. Fear of sickness, death, betrayal, and the unknown. Superstition provided a bridge-way to feel safer in a world that often defied control, no matter how high one's station. As we leave the halls of nobility behind, our journey draws near its end. In our final segment, we will look at how some of these strange superstitions survived, evolved, or disappeared over time, and what echoes of them still remain with us today. Now imagine the slow tolling of a church bell in the distance, echoing across rolling hills and quiet villages. The medieval world begins to fade, its stone walls softened by moss, its old rituals blurred by the passing of centuries. But superstition, unlike stone, does not crumble so easily. It lingers, shifts, and often hides in plain sight. As Europe moved beyond the medieval period, the winds of change began to stir. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in science, logic, and empirical observation. Human anatomy was studied more directly. Disease was traced not to demons or divine wrath, but to microbes and environmental causes. Astronomy slowly pulled itself apart from astrology, and yet many superstitions refused to die. In rural areas especially, old practices endured. Farmers still planted by the moon, Mothers still tied amulets around their children's wrists. Sailors whispered charms to the sea, and villagers avoided walking under ladders or opening umbrellas indoors. The trappings of modernity arrived gradually, and not always convincingly. A printed medical manual might sit beside a bowl of holy water and a pouch of dried herbs. In cities, where universities flourished and trade expanded, skepticism gained ground. But even here, superstition clung to corners of life embedded in architecture, customs, and language. Church bells continued to ring in storms. People threw salt over their shoulders. The number 13 remained a source of discomfort in many regions, and dream books continued to be printed and consulted long after Galileo turned his telescope to the stars. Some beliefs adapted rather than vanished. The idea of the evil eye, for instance, persisted through subtle changes. Today, blue glass talismans still hang in homes across parts of Europe and the Middle East. The superstition has shifted context, but its essence remains. The belief that unseen forces can influence fate, for better or worse. Other remnants live in traditions we barely notice. Wishing on stars, knocking on wood, holding your breath while passing a cemetery. Avoiding black cats or embracing them as lucky, depending on where you live. These gestures may seem quaint or even comical, but they trace faint lines back to times when the world felt more mysterious, and every action held potential meaning. Literature and folklore preserved much of this legacy. Fairy tales, passed down through generations, often carry the shadows of medieval fears, witches in forests, curses, enchanted objects, and the perils of disobedience. Though shaped into children's stories, their roots lie deep in old-world anxieties and beliefs. In some cases, superstition was reshaped by religion rather than replaced. Pilgrimages, relics, and sacred objects continue in many faith traditions, today not always as superstition, but as expressions of reverence and connection. The distinction between faith and superstition can be subtle and is often shaped by culture, language, and time. And then, of course, there are the superstitions we invent anew. The rise of modern sports, for instance, has created its own rituals, lucky socks, repeated gestures, or taboo phrases. In times of uncertainty, people continue to reach for patterns, for explanations, for rituals that bring comfort. In that way, the medieval mindset may not be as far removed from our own as we imagine. As science advanced and literacy spread, many of the more elaborate superstitions of the Middle Ages faded from daily life. But the need that gave rise to them, the need for meaning, for protection, for control, in a chaotic world, remains universal. Tonight, as you prepare to drift into sleep, know that the fears and hopes of those who came before you were not so different. They too looked for signs. They too whispered prayers against the darkness. And in their stories, customs, and quiet rituals, they left behind a map not just of their world, but of the human need to make sense of it. So rest now, with the gentle hum of history in your thoughts. Let the past settle like dust upon old stone, and feel the calm of knowing that even in strange beliefs and forgotten rituals, there is something enduring, something still human. Good night.